Okay, looks like according to my clock, it is 3 o'clock. So one last check to make sure that everyone can hear me and can you see the moving beyond memorization webinar um, slide on your screen right now. Great. I see folks can see what I can see. Now, I'll be checking the chat feature throughout, but I want to make sure that you feel comfortable in just chatting. If you have a thought, a question, if you can't hear me, if the sound goes out, or if I forget to change slides. So, in the beginning, I'm going to make sure that I um, ask you all a few times to just enter in the chat box if I've changed the slides and if you see what I'm seeing. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. We only have an hour to go, and this is going to go by really quickly. So first. Let me thank all of you for participating in this webinar in the Moving Beyond Memorization Advanced Thinking Skills Training webinar. This is part one of two, which our final webinar will take place tomorrow, Thursday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and it will end at 4. So introducing myself, my name is Leonard Geddes. I am the Associate Dean of Co-Curricular Programs at a small private four-year university in North Carolina, Lenore-Rhine University. And there I wear a number of hats, one of which is I run our Learning Commons. And I also am founder of the platform called the Learn Well Projects. And the Learn Well Projects is a platform that is designed to what I call transform good students into great learners. There are our students today are increasingly research has shown that students today are increasingly struggling in rigorous courses. Typically, we see that in college where students who have done well in high school end up going to college and wind up struggling. And it's really frustrating and it can be debilitating. And it's unfortunately led to many students dropping out of college or if not dropping out, significantly underperforming. And now I've had an opportunity to work with dozens of colleges and universities, ranging from private institutions, public, 2-year, 4-year, historically black universities. I have worked with a number of high schools as well, and thankfully, students have been able to succeed. They've been able to make strong gains, and I hope that you all will be able to. We'll go through some things today that will help you be able to help whatever students you're involved with or colleagues improve student learning. So we're going to start off talking about memorization. So let me know if you see a change on your screen. Should say meet Dan. Just type in the chat bar and let me know if you see that. Great. Okay. I see it's working. So these webinars are always weird because you're talking to a screen. It always makes me appreciate people who do television much more because you sometimes realize that they're talking into a screen, and although you can see them, they really can't see you. So I'm going to do my best here to get us through this. So meet Dan. Dan is a good student. In high school, Dan made 4.0 GPA and hardly had to work at it. His knack for making good grades with little effort gave him and his family confidence that Dan would excel in college. Early in his college career, Dan did pretty well. However, around his junior year, he began to have serious academic problems. Dan failed a test. This was very uncommon for him. He used his failure on his first test as a motivation to study harder and longer for the next test, but he bombed that one too. When Dan walked into my office, he no longer was a confident young man. In fact, he was contemplating withdrawing from college to spare his family the expense. However, an hour later, Dan walked out of my office encouraged. He made a 93 on his next exam and never looked back. I have met several Dans and Danettes, if we're going to look at it that way, throughout my working with students. And some of them made 4.0s, some of them were valedictorians, some of them were not. Some of them were just good high school students, some of them struggled in high school, but they all were doing the same thing, which was largely memorizing, trying to memorize their way through college or through high school. And it became a big problem for them. But the biggest problem was that they had always been successful memorizers and it had led to success. And so when it didn't work anymore, they were often encouraged by well meaning educators to study harder or study more or study longer, but no one really told them how to change the very nature of how they interact with academic material. And that's what I've set out to do, is to figure out how can we, in feasible ways, change how students interact with academic content. So, how many of you have met Dans or Danettes in your work or personal experiences? I see some saying, Jason, you say you have. I see Nicole saying you have as well at CVCC. I see Pastor Renee, you see some in your church, maybe in your family. Um, Dude is acknowledging that at University of Dayton. And Adrian, hi Adrian, is acknowledging that at McHenry in Illinois. Yeah, so we all can relate to these people, these experiences of these students who are doing this. So let's undress memorization. So in this first part of this session, I'm going to spend a lot of time just unearthing and us really examining memorization, because memorization is one of the biggest um, it's one of the biggest traps that students fall into when it comes to learning in college. Now, let me be clear: memorization or using the memory is a necessary part of learning. It is not bad in and of itself. It is useful and it is necessary. However, the difference is that students have organized their entire study routine and study perspective around memorization, and we'll explore that as we go through. So, memorization is a mental process whereby students store information for later recall. Again, not bad in itself. It's an intellectual behavior, and memory primarily occurs in the hippocampus of our brain. And if you research things on the hippocampus, it actually says that it has very little or nothing to do with learning. So, without being a neurologist, I think from reading the literature, one would come away with saying that students are actually using a part of their brain, possibly that isn't even designed for learning, yet they're using it trying to learn. So, the part of the brain that we want students to use is in the frontal cortex of the brain, the frontal lobe. It's where the higher order, what we call higher order thinking skills, which are skills that involve applying information, analyzing information, evaluating, synthesizing, creating, all those types of skills that students are using in other contexts of their lives. But in school, in the school setting, they're not using those skills. And so we want to be able to help students begin to use those skills. And so it's useful for them to know that many students are using part of the brain that was never designed for learning. So memorization has distinct features. One is that it's fragile. What that means is that memorization is easily broken apart. We remember something, something else comes up, we forget it. We need other cognitive skills, other mental skills to work along with memorization to make what we're trying to learn stick, to make it congeal, to make it have something that holds it together. So that's one feature. The other feature is that it's fleeting. And what that simply means is we all recall remembering something 1 minute, and then a few minutes later, we can no longer remember that. Well, that's just an example of memory, of the fleeting nature of memory. And so it's important that we begin to convey that to students, that memory is good in some context, but it's not necessarily good for learning, particularly if it's the only skill that we're going to employ. Now, I should say that again, memory isn't necessarily bad in itself. It's just that if we only use it, for that context, for learning alone, then it can be bad. So what you see on your screen now, you should see on your screen, are a number of boxes, and you should see them flickering. Those boxes, particularly the color boxes, represent different parts of information. It could be, this could all be in one course, different concepts, terms, and things in one course, or it could be multiple courses that are spread across. The gray that's in between represents how the information is disconnected. It's just used up space. And so one of the things we know, and this graphic is here just to help you see, to create a visual representation of what students are trying to do in their minds. So students are trying to memorize, and memory-based knowledge is isolated and disconnected, like these particular squares are. And so students have to learn to be able to change how they learn, and we want it to begin to look more like this, where the information is coming together. Instead of it being isolated in its own place, information is gelling together as they interact with content, as they go to class, as they read books, and whatever things they may be doing. And then in the end, they have these sort of nuggets of information, these clusters of information that are rich and deep and are more accessible. And so instead of trying to remember all of those little blocks, what our mind wants to do is it wants to bring that information together in a meaningful way so that we can access it and use it. So I have to go over a few terms in this beginning session just so that we're all on the same page. And so one of the research concepts we're going to look at, or research constructs we're going to look at, is this idea called learning approaches. And all students have learning approaches. And learning approaches basically are students' conceptions about learning, what they believe learning looks like in themselves, in others, what learning entails in terms of how they go about learning. And so again, research says that all students have these approaches, and that these approaches will largely determine what and how students learn. Now, I should clarify myself and say that actually students don't have these approaches. These approaches have students. So learning approaches are like paradigms that students look through, and they color everything that students see in learning environments. And researchers have identified primarily two types of approaches. On the left of your screen, you'll see surface approaches, which surface approaches lead to a certain type of interaction, which we'll explore shortly. I'm just laying the foundation right now. And deep approaches are the opposite of surface approaches, and they lead to a certain type of interaction. So let's talk about a little bit about high school, just because high school is where most students solidify or codify their approach to learning. And in high school, we have what's called the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule is simply this: 80% of what students need to know in high school comes from one source, and that source is their teacher, and it comes usually in the form of the classroom environment. 20% students do on their own. In college, or you could also say in more rigorous courses, whether they be in high school or otherwise, that is flipped, and it becomes the 20-80 rule. And that means 20% of what students need to know comes from um, their instructor, their professor, their teacher, and 80% they have to develop on their own. So let me show you how memory plays into this in the actual classroom. So we're going to look at memory in different settings so that we can fully understand and see the telltale characteristics of memorization. Students tend to go to class and operate under the 80-20 rule. You know what that means is that they go to class and their objective is to record as much information as they can the from the classroom interaction with the teacher, and to recall, to store that in their mind, in the hopes that that information is going to be reflected on their test, on their papers, or on their projects. And their main goal is to store that, memorize it, and to give it back in some similar form. And so the 20% outside of class simply involves rehearsing what was done in class, just ensuring that they've memorized it accurately, and that's what constitutes studying for most students. However, under the 20-80 rule, students have a different approach. They go beyond memorization because they realize that the classroom environment is only giving them a small portion, an important portion, but a small portion of what they need to know, and they have to develop it outside of class. And that development process is foreign to students, and it employs a wide range of skills other than memorization. So on your screen now, you should see um, two boxes, one with surface approaches. And under surface approaches, students are basically knowledge acquirers, meaning they're trying to acquire information. And that's what I mean in high schools, what they're doing most of the time, or often in college courses, they're trying to do the same thing. Tell me what I need to know, and I'll learn it. In fact, just recently, I was meeting with a student at my institution, and he was bombing his course, a couple of his courses, and he articulated what I've heard from students over the years countless times. He articulated it so well. He said, we're a private institution, and we're pretty expensive, at least the price tag is. And he says, he goes, I feel like these professors are trying to trick me. He's like, I go to class, I do what they tell me to do. I take the notes, I go study them, and on the test they have stuff on there that we didn't cover. He said, I feel like they're wasting my money. He said, I don't mind doing the work. They just need to do their job and tell me what I need to know. If they do that, I'll do the work and do my part. How many of you in the chat feature can show me that you've heard students articulate something similar to that before? See, others saying they have. Yes, very common. And the idea is that what I help the student understand is what his perspective was that, again, if you tell me what to do, my job is to go back and do it. And this student was a very successful high school student, very strong GPA, and yet in college he realized that that approach wasn't working. So I had to help him move over here to the left side of the screen to become a knowledge builder. And that is where he began to realize that my professor is giving me some information, but that professor doesn't see their role as to prepare me by giving me everything I need to know. I'm going to have to take what's done in class, and I'm going to have to learn how to build my knowledge so that I can learn the information that I need to learn, and I can learn it at the depth in which I need to learn it. So the best tool that we have available to us to deal with students and help students overcome memorization. When I say memorization, again, I'm not saying memorization alone, where students try to study simply by memorizing things alone, is metacognition. And the layman's definition for metacognition is simply thinking about our thinking. And as the graphic on the screen illustrates, it's this ability to examine your mind. So while you're thinking about something, the ability to step back and think about what you're thinking about. Now, let me be clear with metacognition because it can be somewhat confusing to people. So I've been using this for quite some time. So I want to make sure that it's very understandable to the audience. So metacognition is not thinking. Metacognition is not studying. It is the framework that creates the conditions for how we're going to study. It is the most, in my estimation, it is the most important part of studying, and many would argue that metacognition is critically important, and yet it's often overlooked. It's an overlooked component in learning. So, again, to give you an example of metacognition operating, now, if some of you, I've been to your institutions and have done workshops, so you're not allowed to answer this question. To the rest of you, you're free to answer this question. The question is, what is a sound in every song that is the most common sound, but is also the most unrecognized or unappreciated sound? So again, what is the sound? What is a sound that's in every song that is the most common sound, but it is also the most unrecognized or underappreciated sound? You all can take a stab at that really quickly in the chat box. What do you think? Okay, melody. I see one. Anybody else have any ideas? The rest of you scratching your head? All right. Well, I'll move us forward because I want to make sure. And silence in between every song, in between the lyrics that we hear and the actual the words that we hear and the beats and all the instruments, there's this silence that we hear that's in between, and that silence is just as important, if not more important, than what we actually hear. It's in the backdrop, and if you change the silence in between everything, it speeds the song. You can speed the song up, you can slow it down, and so those little breaks, those mini pauses in between, are very important, but yet we don't recognize them. We focus on what we hear, but yet we don't actually pay attention to the things that we don't hear. So that's how metacognition operates. Cognition or thinking is what we're focused on. So if I'm reading a book, I'm aware of what I'm reading. If I'm studying, I'm consciously focused on what I'm studying. However, metacognitively, I may be totally unaware and missing out on how my mind is operating at that level. And so the key to success is actually aligning students' metacognition with their cognition, or their thinking with their thinking. So here's a research definition of metacognition, and it's an older definition, but it's one that I still love. And it says metacognition is an appreciation of what one already knows, together with a correct apprehension of the learning task and what knowledge and skills it requires, combined with the agility to make correct inferences about how to apply one's strategic knowledge to a particular situation and to do so efficiently and reliably. So that's a lot of words, and here's a way of looking at that in a easier way. So again, it's not studying, it's this set of questions, it's this way of inquiry that we go about learning that many of us may do uh, unknowingly, but our students are unaware of this. And if we can help them become aware and to control this process, they will become better learners. So let's say I'm studying the scientific method. If my metacognitive conditioning, again, this isn't my actual studying, I'm doing this in milliseconds. I'm thinking, okay, what do I know about the scientific method? Do I know a little? Do I know a lot? The next question I'm going to be asking, and these aren't the metacognitive questions, these are just types of metacognitive questions. The next question I'm going to be asking is, okay, what must I know? If I'm going to take a test on it, or if I'm going to have to write a paper on it, what type of knowledge do I need to demonstrate on that particular test or on that paper um, about the scientific method? The next one, going around clockwise, how do I get to what I need to know? If I know nothing or little about the scientific method, I need to know how the scientific method differs from other types of inquiry or other types of scientific discovery. Then how do I get there? What strategies will get me there? Will I read a book? Will I go to class? Will I use some kind of annotation system? What's the quickest and surest way of me getting there? Because no one wants to waste time. And then finally, what will I be able to do with my knowledge about the scientific method that I currently am unable to do? that's sort of in the backdrop of how students go about framing and thinking that allows metacognitively aware students to outperform their peers. So here's some research about metacognition, and I'll just highlight a few of these just for time's sake. A couple of the really important ones that I'll point out. One is that metacognition, this first one up here, metacognitive skills have been correlated with improved grades and cumulative course grades and GPA. So this ability to think about your thinking is very important in academic performance. Students down here at the bottom, with students with solid metacognitive abilities are typically academically strong students. They're typically better readers. Here's another very important point I want to hit on, because oftentimes I meet with people and they say, well, you don't know the students I work with. I work with students who are in developmental ed programs, or I work with students who are this. One of the interesting uh, research components about metacognition is that the fact that students are exercising academic skills is evidence that they are indeed capable of developing their metacognition regarding those skills. And what that simply says is that if students are thinking in a class, if they're using a skill in a class, then they can become better. They can use metacognition better with that task. If they're writing, they can become more metacognitively aware when writing. Um, Metacognitive skills can be done in the short term and yet yield impressive results, like in the case of Dan and the other students that I've been able to work with. And also, metacognitive skills are readily accessible, which means that you don't have to do a lot of rigmarole to try to get students to access them. They're actually right there available for us to be able to access and use. A couple of other things is that metacognition um, actually started working with students who are on learning disabilities, and that those who are academically weak can benefit from metacognitive interventions as well. So, and it's linked to critical thinking and intelligence. And a couple other things that aren't reflected in this particular slide is that metacognition actually research shows that students who are more metacognitively aware will outperform their peers. And also, students who are not metacognitively aware will struggle to make above average grades in rigorous courses. And the research further says that not only will those students struggle to make above average grades, their grades will eventually start to decline. And it's mainly because of memorization, that they're going to try to memorize. Eventually, they become overloaded with information and they don't even remember what they were remembering before because of the volume that they're trying to memorize. And so their grades actually decline. So the good news with metacognition is that people engage in metacognition from age 3, meaning that 3-year-olds are thinking about their thinking, researchers have found. The issue is that we have to help students become aware of their metacognitive functioning and to be able to help them learn to control it. So on your slide, you should see a slide that says good student to great learner transformation process. And in the middle of the screen here, you see a line represents a continuum from a metacognitive awareness to metacognitive control. And this is how you could expect your students to travel along in the stages they're going to hit as they become more metacognitively aware. Now, the good news is that these stages, students can go through these stages rather quickly. Students can advance in their metacognitive knowledge sometimes in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, simply because in a session, simply because they already have this operating, they just are unaware of it. And so the more insight they gain and the more practice they get in actually using this skill, the better and the quicker they're going to be able to use it. So let's look at the first stage, is simply unconscious usage. And that simply means that students have a skill. Students have this skill in mind, but they simply are unaware of it. They're not aware that they're actually using this skill. So it's using them as opposed to it being able to use instead of I'm sorry, it's using them as opposed to them being able to actually use the skill itself. So what we need to do is give them some information about metacognition and its utility, kind of what I'm doing now, sharing with students. Hey, I see you're studying. I see you're putting in time in this. let me show you something that can help you get more out of the time that you're putting in. It's this thing called metacognition, and going over it with them. And we're going to get to the diagram here shortly, and that will be a big source of the big way that you can work with students. Then the next stage they're going to hit is conscious incompetence. And this is where the learner is aware of this thing called metacognition. Okay, I see this operating now. I can tell how I'm thinking about how I'm thinking. However, they're unable to use it because they haven't had enough practice. And so you're going to give them some training where we actually model with students, which we'll get into some today, and then also some in tomorrow's webinar. And then we're going to give them feedback, how they're doing with it, what they're doing well, what they can improve upon. That's going to move them to stage 3, which is conscious competence. And that is when the learner can actually execute the skill, but it requires a lot of concentration. Just like anything we do, we learn something new, we have to focus on it a lot. Then with practice and experience, these students move toward the final stage, which is unconscious competence. And that is where the skill is actually second nature. They're not thinking about it anymore. They've integrated the skill into their normal thinking, and they now can exhibit a high degree of metacognitive control. So let's look at this simple thing about how students learn. There's a lot of literature out about how students learn, and I've tried to focus on something that's simple but yet effective with students. And so it's a simple 3-step way of looking at how students learn. The first way that students learn is that research says that studying is a goal driven activity. And all that simply means is that the very nature of studying, the very act of studying, means that students are seeking to fulfill a learning goal. However, the research also says that most students don't know the goal that they're trying to operate on. So they operate on what I call the default goal. And the default goal, since high school is where students solidify their studying habits, the default goal is typically the goal that they used in high school, which we've already established is memory based. So that's important for you to know that all students have a goal in mind or goals in mind, and that goal is going to usually be a memory based goal. That whatever goal they have in mind is going to trigger a certain type of interaction or a certain way of thinking, and that way of thinking is going to lead to outcomes throughout and at the end of the learning process. And those outcomes are what students then bring to their exams or or reflected on their papers, so on and so forth. So this process is very important for students to know because it helps them be able to see the process in which how they're building their knowledge. So if I'm doing the scientific method, I have a goal in mind about what I'm going to get from the scientific method. I'm going to interact with content, and throughout that interaction and at the end of that interaction, I'm going to generate these light bulbs that are going to go off. Like, oh, I know this. I've learned this. Okay, I can move on to another topic or another concept. And that's what I bring to my test. So if you have your diagram with you, you might want to get that out because we're going to go cover that. And then we're going to give you a little practice with that. Then we're going to give you an assignment. And then we will end today's session. So just for sake of interaction, just type in there if you have your yes or no if you have your diagram in front of you. Great. I see some yeses. Hi, Shannon. I don't think I've said hi to you yet. Great. Okay, so we're going to hit this diagram and we'll show you kind of how to use this. And this is going to, I should introduce it. So the Think Well, Learn Well diagram is a metacognitive tool. And its goal is to align students' metacognitive functions with their cognitive functions or their thinking, along with the types of outcomes that they need to reach. And I created this diagram a couple years ago, and it's now used by more than 2,000 colleges and universities and now high schools around the world. And it's been pretty effective. In fact, if you look around on my blog, on my website called The Well, you'll see a number of articles written by me, and some people have commented about how they've used it. And I'd like you all to consider commenting on the blog about how you've used it and how your students have used it. I know a number of faculty have their students request this from the website every year because in August and in January, we usually get a lot of requests from students who have been told to request it as part of their classes. So I know that other faculty have found ways to use it as well. So let's look at the diagram. So first of all, the color, the gradient, the light blue color change to dark blue is to represent water. The visual representation is to convey, just like in the ocean or in water, the lighter the water here at the top, the shallower, and as you go down, the deeper the water, the darker it gets. If you go to the right of the diagram, that is to communicate surface approaches and deep approaches that I introduced earlier. And so surface approaches correspond with shallower types of interaction. That's why it's in the lighter part. And deep approaches correspond with deeper types of approaches, which is why it's in the deeper part. Now, the reason these two arrows are going in the same direction is that surface approaches to learning correlate with lower order thinking skills. And I'll explain what those thinking skills are in a second. Deep approaches correspond with higher order thinking skills. And if you're in education, then you probably know that a lot of our conversations about student performance have been around getting them to think critically and or think in higher order thinking skills. The critical thinking involves analyzing and evaluating, which are uh, which are higher order thinking skills, and they require a deep approach to learning. So that's the relationship between the color and the two arrows. Let's look at the top part. The first column, metacognitive learning goal. If you're taking notes, you want to write this down on your diagram or you want to type this in somewhere. So metacognitive learning goals, at the top of that, you can write the word trigger, trigger. This column is the most important column in the entire diagram because whatever is done in there is going to automatically trigger a certain type of thinking that is going to lead to different outcomes. So metacognitive learning goal, what are they? Here's another thing you may want to write down. Metacognitive learning goals are statements or questions that drive our thinking. I'm actually typing this in the chat box. Statements or questions that drive our thinking. Um, so they're very important because the research says that they are largely unknown to students. Metacognitive learning goals, which I'll abbreviate MLGs, are largely unknown. Meaning that students aren't even aware that these goals are there. They just know that, hey, I'm studying and I'm learning something. But that something that is oftentimes vague is being determined by the goals that they have in mind. So it's very important that we understand that column. The middle column, Bloom's higher order thinking skills. Bloom's higher order thinking skills is a classification of intellectual behavior that can be used. And basically, it says that when we think thoughts, it's going to fall on one or more of these 6 levels. Remembering is the most shallowest type of thinking. Creating down at the bottom is the deepest type of thinking. On the top of this column, you can write my thinking. My thinking. So metacognitive learning goal, at the top of that, you wrote trigger. And then on top of the Blooms, you can write my thinking. And then the final column is the corresponding learning outcomes. On the top of that, you can write what I'm able to do with what I've learned. What I'm able to do with what I've learned. And metacognitive learning goals are important because, as we all know, students will often say, I know this material, or they'll take a test and they'll feel like they know the material, and they'll take the test and they'll recognize a lot of information, but they don't actually have the information. They can't actually um, perform it well on test. And it's often because what they we have to push them beyond simply knowing the material to being able to identify the precise level of knowledge that they have. And so this is a different task for students. Students don't realize that knowledge has multiple dimensions. They just think I know it or I don't know it. And this is very empowering because students who struggle oftentimes just believe, oh, I can't learn this material. I just don't know math, or I just don't know this subject, or I just don't know this. But if we can help them break it down and say, okay, there are different levels to knowing. What part do you know? What part don't you know? And let's see where you are on this continuum, and let's see how what you think you're supposed to be knowing is aligned with what you actually are supposed to be knowing. So it's very empowering, that flexibility of giving students the ability to understand that there are variations to knowing material, and it's not just either I know it or I don't. So again, the trigger, the thinking in the middle, the outcomes. And the reason the outcomes say corresponding is because they correspond to whatever thinking level I have, and that thinking level is all determined by the goal that I have in mind. So let's look at this diagram here, and let's look at the well. Let me say this as an overview first. The challenge with students who struggle is that students tend to operate where the red box is. They tend to want to memorize always and only, maybe get into a little bit of understanding just because they get into if they study a long time. But oftentimes when they're tested, if you can see this other blue box down here toward the bottom, they're tested on things that are much deeper. They're tested on analyzing and evaluating and those types of things. And that there's a big difference in the cognitive functions that are used to get to that level than at the other levels. Now let me back up for a minute and say that students are using the higher order thinking skills in a variety of areas in their life. So if you work with adult students have jobs, they have families, some of them are managers in places, some of them they've worked. They're using these skills. And I know when you talk to them, you can see that they have these skills in place in other contexts. The problem is that they don't know that those same skills can help them in school. And even if they do know, they don't know how to access them and bring them over and transfer them to the academic setting. And we're going to get into some of that tomorrow about how to actually get them to do that. So it's important that I kind of lay that out there. So let's put this to practice because I'm going to have you all do this as an assignment. The first column, first row, the metacognitive learning goal says to identify or define information. Students seek to answer some form of this what-based question. Can I list or define the key terms? Now, what this simply means is that embedded in students' mind, usually outside of their awareness, they're trying to figure out this. They're asking this what I call a what-based question. And all that what-based question mean is that at the heart of their question and their interaction is what is this? So if I'm using the example of the scientific method, my question is what is the scientific method? Now I want to just emphasize that students don't actually ask that question. It's embedded in their mind. So you won't see students come to you and saying, I'm trying to figure out what the scientific method is. You'll see it much differently. And I'll describe how you'll see it once I kind of lay out the sequence here. So in my mind, I'm asking, what is a scientific method? Because that's the goal that's in there, it's going to trigger an automatic type of thinking, which will lead to memorization, which will lead to remembering. And so it means that I'm going to work my mind is going to work to recall and to remember the definition of it's going to work to learn and remember the definition of the scientific method. So I will say the scientific method is yada 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 yada. Then I'm going to work at that level. I may use a variety of methods here. I may try to use, I may highlight a book. I may use flashcards. I may write about it. I may go to class. Whatever it be, whatever it is, my thinking level that's going to be operating is going to be remembering. So at the end of that process, whether that end be 2 minutes, 2 years, 2 weeks, I'm going to be able to recall or duplicate information. And it says students will be able to reproduce information in a similar form as the original source. This corresponds to tasks in which cues are embedded. So what that simply means is this, that students are going to be able to define I will be able to define the scientific method. And if I get tested, which is what this task means, if I get a test or if I have to write a paper on the scientific method, and if that test has maybe um, some of the definition in there, then I can link that up. I can mentally match that with the scientific method. So it has a cue embedded in it, and it can trigger my memory and say, oh, okay, that particular question goes with this answer that I've stored in my mind. So that's for that one level. The question is, how do we get students to deepen that process? And the way they deepen that process is to go down one level and they change their learning goal, because the goal is going to trigger their interaction. So the next goal, one level down, says to explain information. Students seek to answer some form of this why-based question. Can I explain the reasoning behind the ideas and concepts? Still using the scientific method, instead of asking what is the scientific method, let's say my goal that's embedded in my mind is, why is the scientific method important to science, to discovery? Why is it important? Well, now, because I've had that question in my mind is going to automatically work at this level. And it's going to seek to explain or provide rationales that support why the scientific method is important. And because it's worked on that level, I'm going to be able to do exactly what my goal set out to do, which was to explain why the scientific method is essential um, to um, to understanding how discovery happens in science. And the type of task, if I get a essay test, something like that, a basic essay test, I should say, because there are analytical essay tests. If I get a basic essay test or a basic type of interaction question, then I'll be able to do okay on that test, because the way that I thought about the material when I was studying is very similar to the way that I'm going to have to think about it on that task. So there's an alignment there, and so on and so forth down the diagram. And so the point being that whatever goal is in mind, our mind is going to seek to fulfill it. So let me take this out of an academic context, as I commonly do with students and with educators when I do workshops. Let's say you're hungry and you want a burger. Let's say you go to your favorite burger place and you go in there and they say, "Oh, we're out of burgers," and you're going to say, "Oh man, you're out of what? You're out of burgers? Oh my gosh, I'm so hungry." So what that means then is you're going to probably leave that place and go somewhere else that's going to satisfy your desire to get a burger. Even if you eat the soup, you're probably not going to be satisfied, because you came in with a goal, with the desire of getting a burger. So that's how our mind works in terms of goal drivenness. In the same way, when we begin to create and help students create these goals in students' minds, then what happens is they begin to seek to fulfill that goal. So just like the burger, if students have a goal in mind to understand why the scientific method is important, well, then their mind is going to wrestle with that information at that level. And either one of two things is going to happen. Either the student is going to have to consciously abort the process, saying, okay, I've tried to understand why the scientific method is important, and I don't understand it. Which is a good thing, because most students do the opposite. They actually believe they learned the material, but they didn't. If they can at least consciously recognize that I'm trying to operate at this level and didn't do it, then at least that's an improvement. However, what most students will do, because that goal is in there, their mind will continually work until they get that, what I call the sense of I got itness, that aha, I know this, I got this, I know this now. And at that moment, that's when they have their learning outcome over here on the right side of the diagram. Okay? So does that make sense to you all? Give me some feedback in the chat feature, because I just covered a lot of very important material. Let me know if anything is unclear. Made sense? Okay. Need a couple other responses? Sounds clear. Good examples. Great. Okay, great. Thank you. So we're all on the same page. Okay, so on and so forth. We're gonna go about making goals. Now, let me tell you how you may see it on your end. because you're not going to see it as clear as this. What's going to happen is you're going to get a student's notes, or you may see a student's notes. And let me get out this image here, and their notes may look like this. Work with me, screen. I'm pausing my screen, so when I show the next thing, you'll have to make sure that I actually bring that up here, because okay. Okay, you all can probably barely see this study note image. Can you all at least see the different colors of the sticky notes on the screen? Okay, great. So what this is what you may see in your office. You may see students feverishly working to to do the best they can at studying. And what we have here is, and I want to make this large. I just don't want to get out of the screen here. What we have here is students who have basically a bunch of definitions. These are nursing students. I know you can't see that as well, and if I try to get closer, it just gets blurry. But I often take pictures of students' notes around my office, and I often listen to students study. And every time, what I'm listening for and what I'm actually looking for in their notes is I'm looking for the level of interaction. I don't care about their study method, what they're using. What I'm looking for is how they're interacting with it. And far more often than not, I realize that students are operating at a very memory based level. So I have the diagram in my head, but when you're doing it, you may go to your diagram and realize that, oh, these students, they're trying hard and all they have are a bunch of definitions for terms. And what I usually say to students at that point is I say, this is useful, but it's probably not the best use of your time. One reason is because you're not going to be able to remember all of that with all of the other stuff you're going to have to remember. Secondly, if the course is rigorous, it's probably not going to be testing you on memory based information. So that's one example of how it looks in notes. If you're looking at students' notes, and if you're looking at their textbooks, you may see they've highlighted the bold print. I know many of you can probably type in, yes, I see that all the time, because I know many students do that. And that's not bad necessarily, but it's certainly not sufficient for what they need to do in their courses. And tomorrow we'll get into some of the textbooks applications of this tomorrow. In writing, here's what it may look like in a writing area. So this is something that one of our professors gave back to a student who did well. I'll let you look over that briefly, and I'll highlight a couple of points. This is a evaluation rubric for a writing sample that students had to provide. Now, I want to point out at the bottom here, down in yellow, you should see on your screen, the professor is communicating to the student. She's saying, you're trying to answer all the questions related to form on the assignment sheet rather than focusing on one and connecting it to a larger idea of the story. That's the thinking work that needs to be done. Now, this is invaluable information that many students will be useless to many students and many of us who work with students outside of the classroom, because what this professor is telling the students is that what you're doing is you're providing memory based information. Now, I'm not going to show the students whole paper on here, of course, but I've had a chance to read the student's paper. And in reading that paper, what the student did was she basically recalled what was in the story. How many of you have seen students in their writing, or you've seen professors get frustrated with students because what they're doing in their writing is basically telling them what was said in the writing? They're recounting the story. And professors will get frustrated, of course, because thank you, Christopher, for joining us. I know you're an English teacher, so you see this a lot, I'm sure. And oftentimes educators are trying to tell them, hey, I want you to do more than that. And so with the diagram now, we can show them what more looks like. So those are two examples I want to show you. Now let me back up, get back into our presentation here, and kind of take it from there and give you all an assignment. We have about 5 more minutes. Okay, do you all see the diagram back up on your screen? Great. Okay, so here's how this plays out. Dan, our student, goes to take a test. He doesn't do well. He studies. He doesn't do well on that test. He increases his study time, increases his effort, and what he's doing at that time is he's trying to work on two things: how much he remembers. So if he, let's say stereotypically, if he used flashcards, let's say the first test he used, maybe he had 50 flashcards that he remembered. Well, the next test he's gonna use 100 for it. So he's doubled his effort. And the second thing, in addition to the quantity, he's going to look for how accurately he knows it. So he's assuming the reason he did poorly on the test is because he didn't memorize enough, and what he memorized, he didn't memorize well enough. With the student who wrote the paper, they're going to believe that the reason their professor wants a longer paper is because they want them to give them more of what they read in the book. I want you to be able to recall more. Give me more of the characters, more of this. When in fact, the professor is looking for something much different. So to put this into context, let's say a student was reading Othello in a class. Student goes out, they're reading Othello, and and what they're focused on is maybe the memory based level stuff, which would be the characters, the plot, the setting, all those kinds of things, which are important. Don't get me wrong, these are important things. But on the test, or what the professor is looking for, or the teacher is looking for on the paper is, what's the role of evil in Othello? And we all know when students get that test question, they look up like, huh? What was that? Like, we never went over that in class. What are you talking about? That was never something, that was not part of the deal. And that's because that requires, down here on the diagram, analytical thinking. Now you're taking this concept of evil that's throughout the book, and you're analyzing it and you're evaluating it. Maybe the professor may ask not only what's the role of evil in Othello, but what does the role of evil in Othello tell us about the role of evil in the world today? Whoa, hold up. We didn't cover that. I'm not equipped to do that. And so, unfortunately, students will take that information and they'll go back and they'll think they need to just remember more stuff, when in fact, this requires thinking, not memorization. This requires understanding. This requires applying that information to an outside context. And so, just showing you that those are the different things that it requires. So, in essence, students engage in what I call horizontal thinking, which those arrows going across your screen means that they continue to think on that level regardless of how they perform. And what we have to do is to get them to begin to think downward. So, here's an assignment that I'd like you all to do as we end today's webinar. I'd like you to select, well, I'm going to put this up on the screen, but let me back up to show you what I did so you'll have this. Remember, with the scientific method, my first metacognitive learning goal at the most basic level was, what is the scientific method? My next one was, why is the scientific method important? My next one would be, how does the scientific method work? Or how is the scientific method used in an example? If I was to go down another level to the analyzing level, it would be, how does this, because I'm comparing and contrasting, distinguishing at that level, which is one of the more difficult levels that students have trouble with. From the analyzing onward, downward is where students tend to struggle. But the next one I'm asking, how does the scientific method differ from other modes of inquiry? And then maybe in evaluating, I'm asking myself, um, what might be, given these experiments, which one most accurately or best applied the scientific method? And then the creating one would be me maybe creating an experiment using the scientific method. The point being that all of those goals are going to shape how I think about the material, and each goal is going to trigger an entirely different type of interaction. So here's your assignment that I like to give you all. Let me skip through this. Here's the assignment. I'd like you to select two different topics, themes, or concepts that you know little or maybe nothing about. I'd like you to study one of them in whatever way you would normally study. If you can, forget about all we talked about today and try to just study it the way you would normally study it. Or try to study in the way that your students study it if you prefer that method. Then I'd like you to take the other term. I'd like you to study it using the Think Well, Learn Well diagram in the way that I just did. And what I'd like you to do is to simply create metacognitive learning goals. Okay, not the answers, just the goals for the concept that you're studying. So remember my scientific method uh, just example as a model for you to use. After you've done that, I like you to record both interactions. You simply write them down. This shouldn't take more than 15 minutes, and then compare and contrast what you have between the two documents. And then if you can, send me the results of what you have before the comparison, both the results, the term that you used, the terms that you used, and then the interactions that were created both ways. I'd like you to send me the results before tomorrow's webinar, if possible, because I like to use them in the webinar. And this will give you an idea of this idea of what I call outcome variation, which is a very important skill for students to have, which is the ability to vary your outcomes with the same content. So it's taking one theme, one concept, one idea, and being able to reach multiple outcomes with that. So do you all feel like you're clear on that assignment? Great. So that is going to conclude our webinar for today. Tomorrow, we're going to get into some specific applications of how to use this in different contexts. Oh, send it to which address? You can send it to my Learning at the Learn Well Projects address. And I'm going to type this in the chat feature so you'll have that. So you can send it to Learning at the Learn Well Projects. Are there any questions? You all are officially free to go, but if there are any questions, I'll linger around and ask. And I'd love to hear feedback from you all on how useful this was, or what was clear, what was unclear, that kind of thing. That will help me in formulating tomorrow's session. Bye bye, Adrian. Thanks for attending. See you tomorrow. Bye, Pastor Renee. See you, Jason. Thank you. Yes, I'll unmute you. Let me find the feature here. Okay, I can hear you now, Nicole. And anyone else who's on here can hear you as well.
Okay, great. And I also have Arlene Neal with me.
Hi, Arlene.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Fine. I enjoyed this.
Good, thank you.
So my question is, how do you assess where the student is in their level of learning?
Yeah, in their level of the diagram, you mean? Or
Mm-hmm.
so what I do is I look at student notes. Oftentimes, I listen. I look at their notes. I listen to them talk, and I will look at their papers, and I look at what they highlight in the book. So this is what I call their evidences of knowledge. And I'll bring this up to you. This kind of goes beyond the webinar here, so I'm going to actually stop the webinar, but I'll continue with you here and share this with you. Hold on a second. Where is my screen here?